Let's start. Right. So our special guest today is Professor Susan Morrison. Good morning, Professor Morrison. And
good morning.
Good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. So Professor of English at Texas State University, Susan Morrison's books include The Literature of Waste, Material Ecopoetics and Ethical Matter, and Excrement in the Later Middle Ages, Sacred Filth, and Chaucer's Fecopoetics. So these two brilliant books. Her articles explore comparative medieval literature, gender and cultural studies, pilgrimage, and the environmental humanities. A broader audience has accessed her work on waste studies through interviews with Slate, Wired, History Channel, American Public Media, and The New Yorker. It's such a pleasure to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Morrison. And
thank you. It's a delight to be here. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for agreeing to be a part of this interview immediately. So in our discussion today on wasting and being wasted, self-animal society, that's how we have named it, we will try to locate the essence and aesthetics of waste as both leftover end products or beginning products in Professor Morrison's absolutely fascinating book, The Literature of Waste. And if you have any questions, please write them in the chat box, or you can ask them directly at the end of the session. So here goes my first question to you, Professor Morrison. Let us begin with the regenerative power of waste. How can waste be reintegrated into society, not just through material recycling, but politically or even aesthetically?
So I think one of the first issues with waste is simply recognizing it. When I started working on excrement waste, people made lots of jokes because I was working on such a shocking or seemingly silly topic. And so one of my, and I was fine, people made lots of puns because waste and excrement just demand a lot of puns, I think in part because people are uncomfortable with the topics. But I wanted people to be able to recognize how it is integral to who we are, integral in our actual lives, and also integral to literature, art, how we think philosophically, and so on. So when I was first working on this topic, people didn't see it. They didn't want to see it because it makes them uncomfortable. I'm sure we'll talk about that. But now I see virtually everything with sort of waste glasses. And once you do that, I think it actually is a good thing for society to help people see how waste is really an integral part of our lives. If for no other reason, environmentally, it's very easy to ignore the waste that we create, our pollution, if we just put it to a side and don't recognize it. But if we realize we're living mired in waste, then we might feel compelled to do something about it actively.
Right. So so there is often this comparison between people in poverty and garbage. So cases like these are especially true for a country like India, where individuals belonging to lower castes primarily, or even minority groups, for example, the Muslims right now, or simply those living in slums are regarded as waste and by extension disposable. So I think an interesting association could be formed regarding the employment of Dalits as sewer cleaners, and they are at the lowest rung of the caste system here, and they are the ones who clean the manholes, so to say. So could you suggest a way to disentangle this?
That one of the most inspirational writers for me is Zygmunt Bauman in his book Wasted Lives. And in that book, he talks about groups of people, and they vary culture, the time period of that culture, and so on. Groups of people who are wasted in a particular culture. He looks at refugees, for example. You could look at the homeless. You could look at the caste system in India. In the Nazis, of course, Jews and others were wasted people. And writing my book on waste, I first look at material instances of waste and how different schools like philosophy, gender, history has looked at waste. But what really drives me in the project is the metaphor of waste, as you're bringing up, how people are rendered metaphorically as waste. And so I'd say in the case that you're talking about, where wasted people become the people who clean up waste, literally, wasted people in whatever culture are treated as waste. They're made cognate to waste and deserve, from the logic of that ideology, deserve to deal with the waste of non-wasted people, the privileged, so that the privileged cannot be seen as waste. Of course, the irony is that we all produce waste, and it's just a false distinction. So I guess that's what I would say as an initial answer to your question.
Right. And do you think, a lot of these associations, what you just said, have to do with the aspect of visibility, let's say? For example, those who stay near dumping grounds are by default considered inferior, or people living on roads with their part of waste production available in full sight. So, this is a very personal anecdote, probably. I don't even know if that's the word for it. But there's an instance where I remember this particular event from back in my school days, and there used to be an elongated slum attached to a flyover nearby. And I saw all kinds of expensive cars passing a child who was defecating on the road with his back to us. So it's a classic instance of literal waste creation. And eventually the government evicted them to aestheticize the city. And usually they don't end up receiving substitute homes. So do you think it's really has to do with visibility?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Those who are seen as waste in society are rendered invisible because the rest of society doesn't want to recognize the waste that is there, and that the waste that the privileged, in fact, also are and produce. They think of themselves as different. And so people who are considered waste are relegated to wasted geographical areas. Now, sometimes those geographical areas were waste areas initially because they flood, or there's no place to grow plants there. So there was something wrong with that area for human sustenance in the first place. But then those areas tend to be where you have landfills, where smelly industries construct buildings. And so over time, the wasted area literally becomes an area of waste. And the only place that wasted people can afford to live, if they have homes at all, is in that area. And so those places are usually on the edges or just outside a city. And within the city, then you have the proper neighborhoods and so on, which are not seen as wasted areas. And if I could just give an example from a student's master's thesis, she was working on Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye, which is a brilliant book. If any of the people in the audience have not yet read it, I highly recommend it. And so I was working with her on this, and I actually, for personal reasons, went to the city where Toni Morrison grew up and where The Bluest Eye is set, Lorain, Ohio. And while I was there, I was looking at Zillow, which is a very popular real estate site in the United States where people can look and see what houses are for sale and how much they cost. And what I noticed is that the houses in Lorain, many of them were very cheap, much cheaper than they would be in, say, a city like Austin, where I live, Austin, Texas. And I mentioned this to my student, and she looked into it more, and we discovered that the houses that are cheap now in 2020, last year, when she was working on this, were in areas in 1940, 80 years ago, that were redlined. Redlining is something in the United States where certain areas of a city were literally redlined on the map by a entity like the city council. And those areas, there would be areas that would be designated good for white people to live in, and then areas for typically African Americans or other people of color to live in. And 80 years ago, these areas were redlined. That's where many of her characters live in The Bluest Eye. 80 years later, it has economic effects still on the city, even though redlining has stopped, because those were wasted people. They were seen as waste in the society. They were near industrial sites and so on. So these things, they may seem invisible, but it still is visible in so many different ways. For example, a real estate site today, you can see where wasted people did live and still do live.
Right. And then do you believe that that most of the notions surrounding waste are 20th century capitalist constructions? And I'm specifically referring to let's say something like wasted time, and the way it is linked to productivity and labor. So let us imagine these instances, staring at a painting for an hour, or looking outside the window, or loitering aimlessly in a locality, regularly procrastinating, counting stars, or especially waiting endlessly. So there is some kind of deep connection between waiting and wasting.
I know, it's true. And that is an aspect of capitalism. Of course, I'm a medievalist, so my interest is in cultures 1,000 years ago, 600 years ago, where waste is present too. But this idea of wasting time and so on, I do think is linked to industrialization. But there's been pushback to it. There's something called the slow movement. So there are like the slow food movement. It takes longer to prepare certain kinds of food. Slow cinema, very slow takes in a movie, for example. Slow art, slow cams. So cams are like cameras put on, for example, nature cams. So there'll be a permanent 24-hour-a-day camera just showing a bird's nest. And you can look at it for hours if you want to, and you see how the bird interacts with its eggs and then its chicks and so on. For a long time, there was a very popular cam put on a cheddar cheese that was aging, because you don't just make cheese, you have to let it sit for a long time. And so this caused quite a little sensation about 10 years ago. There's a video artist named Bill Viola who specializes in very slow movement in the video art that he produces. Personally, I'm very interested in what I call slow pilgrimage ecopoetics, because pilgrimage is one of my interests, and pilgrimage traditionally was done by walking, which is inherently a slow process, and what you can learn from that slowness. So yes, I think that this idea of wasting time is a link to capitalism, but I do think there's a lot of pushback in different arenas through what's called the slow movement in different ways.
Right. So let's shift a little bit to literature now. In The Unbearable Lightness of Being, one of my most favorite novels, Kundera writes about entire cities built upon gutter pipes and human waste. So right from architecture to the unconscious as a storehouse of wasted memories, waste is perhaps the only unquantifiable strand of human life that exponentially grows with age. And why do you think there is such aversion towards it? And I'm not just referring to its visual characteristic, but even to the words related to it. We won't use the word muck, filth, just like that. Exactly, yeah. So.
Well, I mean, it depends on your perspective. Freud would say that we avoid waste because we fear our own decay and death, even as we may desire it in Freud's theories. But I think basically we fear our death and our decay. There's anthropological work by Mary Douglas that looks at the binary dirty and clean. And she investigates important works like Leviticus, which lay out distinctions between what is clean behavior, what is dirty behavior. Bakhtin would talk about the upper bodily stratum and the lower bodily stratum. Of course, he delights in the lower bodily stratum, and I do too, because it's part of waste. But many people would prefer to focus on the upper bodily stratum, which is the proper part of society, as opposed to the area of sexuality and waste production. And you do see in words themselves our feelings towards the language. I teach a course on the history of the English language, and part of our work is looking at Middle English, which was the language spoken in the late Middle Ages till about 1500. And it's often said that England was a trilingual society with Latin, French, and English, or Old English becoming Middle English. And Latin, of course, was the highest class language because it was just relegated to a few scholars. And those words that are Latin-based for waste, specifically excrement, that's one of my interests. Excrement and feces are Latin-based words. Those words you can say publicly to your doctor, you'd probably use those words. A French word, which is next down on the hierarchical scale, is manure, which is used to talk typically about animal waste. And that's okay to say. It's from the French word hand, and it's because manure would have been turned by hand in the field, and that's okay to say. But those Germanic words for waste, the lowest level of the society, because that would have been the vast number of people, many of them farmers themselves or laborers, such as shit and turd, are from Germanic languages. So you can even see in the language something about the culture, just looking at words for excrement. And notice I used the Latin-based word there to sound very academic and high class. But you can see in the language people's attitudes towards waste, that they feel uncomfortable using those Germanic words that seem more visceral and bring us back to the land, whereas excrement and feces seems to perfume it somehow because it's through this higher class language.
Right, very interesting. So also in the brilliant article, The Perfume of Garbage, I love reading the article as well. Michael Shanks and David Platt and William Ratti discuss the archaeological value of discarded items. So they have broken ceramics, broken or dull stone tools, tool-making debitage, or the melancholic museological merit of 9/11 artifacts like a battered wallet, melted computer screen from the Pentagon, torn clothing, photographs, documents. Now, do you think we recognize waste only when it's available as historical evidence, allegory, or archaeological findings?
We only want to recognize it then. I think we recognize it every day we use the toilet, or we go into a public toilet and somebody hasn't flushed or something. But yes, I mean, I think that's another example of it being sanitized in a certain way. So waste is relic. And I'm really interested in this because I mentioned I do pilgrimage studies as well. Relics are all over pilgrimage studies. And interestingly enough, certain relics in the Christian tradition actually were originally dirt. There's something called holy dust or holy dirt. And people would go to tombs of people who were perceived to be saints and scrape up dirt and dust from their tombs and sometimes ingest it through holy water. So they're literally ingesting waste, dirt, but for sacred reasons. Even Christ's swaddling clothes when he was a baby were seen as a relic, and his swaddling clothes, since he was fully human, must have had excrement on them. This is a big debate actually among theologians in the Middle Ages, believe it or not. So I think archaeological, so that's one thing is, yes, waste as relics is totally accepted. Archaeological evidence of waste appears in the paper all the time. You often, not infrequently, see articles that talk about coprolites that are found, sort of fossilized excrement. And of course, this is great for historians, archaeologists, and so on to find out about previous cultures. But the media, it's interesting how the media talks about these particular findings. They're often very gleeful and joyful about it, almost as though, oh, see, people back then excreted in this way, or they didn't mind being near their waist and so on, as though they were different, which is not what I've encountered in the Middle Ages at all. People like to stereotype the Middle Ages as, oh, people didn't mind smelling, they didn't mind, excreting anywhere. And that's not true. There's lots of legal cases that are brought against neighbors whose sewage pipe, spills over on their land, or they see them sitting on their privy and they don't want to see them doing that. So I think also how the media portrays things is of interest. And then finally, I just say that you mentioned allegory, I think, as well, the allegory of waste. Allegory sanitizes waste. So even when I say people are perceived metaphorically as waste, I feel uncomfortable doing that, because even saying that strips those people of their humanity. It's sort of a metaphor. By metaphorizing people in that way, it takes away their living nature in a sense. I'm really talking about metaphor then. So I even feel uncomfortable doing it, even while I feel it's necessary to examine that metaphor. Right.
And one of the most memorable lines from Zygmunt Bauman's Wasted Lives is, and I'm quoting, "There can be no artistic workshop without a rubbish heap." And I love that line. Now, the world generates approximately 2.01 billion tons of municipal solid waste annually, and yet the cities have never been this spotless or immaculate before. Now, the question is, where is the government dumping of the garbage? Of course, we know part of the answer, but does our indifference and aversion to it ring the ecological alarm? And that's what I want to bring into the argument.
Yes, so our aversion or indifference to the problem is we need to see our waste to remedy it, to really do something about it. That's one reason why I'm interested in the Middle Ages, because people lived with their waste. People had manure heaps, if they lived in the country, often outside their door or on their land, and these were worth something. People were known in their wills to bequeath their manure heaps because they would be used for the next generation to use it as fertilizer on the field. So it wasn't like people were not aware of their waste. But that's one reason I'm interested in that time period, because at that time there was a real spectrum of attitudes towards waste, from seeing it as useful fertilizer, even looking at it as a kind of resurrection model. You put this waste on the field, you get new crops, and you have this cycle going on. So that's one end of the spectrum. The other end is sort of similar to how we perceive waste as something really terrible. In the Western Christian medieval world, shit was seen as sin, essentially. In Dante, you have some sinners with hanging in shit, basically. So I think this spectrum of views is something that we've lost because we simply don't want to confront it. I think it's changing a little bit now that it's been discovered that things like methane gas or cow excrement or whatever animal's excrement could be used or human could be used for generating energy. So there's an interest in that. We get back to capitalism that way, of course. Just acknowledging waste is an important step forward. And the quote that you just cited, I wanted to cite a counter quote. One of my favorite counter quotes would be from Walter Benjamin. And he writes, "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism." And he talks about the angel of history, this famous image in Benjamin, where we see wreckage upon wreckage piling up, pile of debris grows skyward before us. This storm is what we call progress. So what we see as progress is actually just a pile of debris, but we don't want to recognize it, even though it's beneath and behind everything that we do to have quote unquote progress.
Right. So in your book, you have written at length about the excremental treatment of Jews throughout history and the biblical focus on cleanliness of soul and body. and separation and ostracism of wasted population. However, what still eludes me is the incineration of Jews as rubbish and the simultaneous commercialization and medicalization of their bodies. So on the one hand, in the Nazi camps, let's say, we have Jewish hair and skin converted into bags and soaps. And on the other hand, their living anorexic bodies, they're used to perform medical experiments. How do you negotiate between these two kinds of wasted bodies?
Yeah, that question, I think, is a very profound one. I think we see in this particular instance Jewish bodies being recycled for use and exploitation or profit for the privileged, Nazis, of course. Even medical experiments would profit the privileged in fake knowledge, or getting funded, getting support by higher ups in the Nazi party. And since Jews were seen as waste, they were incinerated as waste would have been incinerated, or they were dumped as waste would have been dumped. So once a population is not seen as fully human, they're seen as waste, they can, one, be destroyed, because what do you do with waste? You throw it out. On the other hand, it can also be used for profit, and until it's no longer of profitable use anymore. And so I think that both make sense to a twisted ideology like fascism in that particular case, since they're not seen as human in the first place.
Right. And modern civilization has always progressed by trashing the lower classes, so to say, and then the disabled, the foreigner, the differently colored, the sick body, women, religious minorities, non-believers, animals, and other such bare bodies. An act you have, very rightly in your book called codification, let's say. You codify the bodies. Now, ironically, the wasted population is the real majority. Now, do you think the capitalist subconscious operates with a real physical fear instead of an economic one? For a moment, let us focus on the flood of disaster, zombie apocalypse, and alien invasion movies emerging out of Hollywood. So do you think they are really symbolic of a future class revolution?
I mean, possibly. There have been a lot of attempts in this sort of, I don't want to say post-COVID period, because I don't think we are post-COVID. I don't think we'll ever be post-COVID. In a sense, it'll always be influencing our lives. But I think there have been very recent attempts, at least in the United States, to organize unions is being revitalized here. The Guardian recently talked about Striketober, that this month has been a time of increased strikes. And I think that wealth disparity has been really recognized in a heightened way at this particular time. So that means that people who traditionally have been wasted, the poorer people, are suddenly seeing that they're being recognized in different ways. I don't know how long this will go on for, but COVID has revealed dramatically this disparity. And if you just look in popular culture, there's a South Korean show called The Squid Game that has gone, I don't know if you say viral, all over the world, which is just one example of how people are recognizing the problematics here. And I also think that it's a physical fear. I think that privileged people fear being infected, so to speak. I could become a wasted person so easily. And I want to be separated from wasted people so I can't get infected by them and become one myself. And of course, this kind of attitude heightens both the physical separation of different classes of people, but also a psychological one, an emotional one as well. And feeds this idea that wasted people are not fully human in some way.
Right. Now, borrowing from William Viney's book, Waste, A Philosophy of Things, do you believe that waste is an intermediate stage, a medial condition between ending of one thing and the making of another? So between a before and the after. So if this is correct, if you agree to what Viney is saying, then is anything truly original isn't all creation through waste and at the same time waste generating?
I arguably yes. I mean, even if you look at the Genesis, God creates order, codification, out of chaos. And even a plant, a fresh new plant, emerges from dirt and soil, which is an environment replete with organisms going through their own life cycle, including their waste life cycle. So once you start seeing waste, you do see it everywhere, indeed at every stage. I would say not just the middle stage. I would perceive it at various stages in a life cycle of either an object or a living being.
Right. Now, one significant thing that waste does is dissolve hierarchy.
Yes.
So it is a common unloading site for junk belonging to all strata of society. So if we go to the dumping ground, we don't really differentiate between what is, what belongs to, or which comes from which house, or what comes from which strata. So a network of narratives where society finds itself refracted, so to say. Now, do you take, in your book, of course, do you take the reverse route? Right. So are you measuring the poetics of wasted thingness, the materiality of litter heap collage, and through that you're arriving at the human rather than from human to waste?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disentangle those two directions of things, but arriving at the human or at the agency of what's been called non-human actors. For example, it doesn't disturb, quote unquote, nature to produce waste. That's part of nature's or non-human actors' way of living. It disturbs us for some reason. And that's creating waste is how regeneration occurs. So I think it's important to see that the human is waste. Human is a waste producer. And that's an absolutely key thing to keep in mind. In the book, when I first wrote the book on excrement in the late Middle Ages, and I called it Fecopoetics because there's the word Ecopoetics, and I wanted to make a pun with feces, so I called it Fecopoetics. And at the end of that book, I proposed that there should be a new way of looking at literature and culture along the lines of gender studies or or Marxist views of literature and culture and so on, but a new way of looking at culture and literature, and that would be through waste studies. So looking at moments of material waste, but also metaphoric waste, and that would mean everything from garbage, trash, and so on, to this more metaphorical use of it. And so I waited around for a couple of years and I thought somebody should write this book. And then it turned out that somebody had to be me. And then I thought, well, I'll just write on every book that, or play or poem that deals with waste. And very quickly I realized I would have to write about hundreds or thousands of texts. In fact, if you look at it from almost using the many definitions of waste, virtually any text deals with waste in some way. So that's why I ended up just doing case studies from a sort of menu of texts from different time periods, because I couldn't tackle everything out there. It's impossible because everything does deal with waste. It's part of what makes us human, is both producing waste and being waste. And so that's what I did in the project of the book.
Right. No, it's a very short question. It's a very direct question. So could you shed some light on how a waste poet, as a ragpicker, cures homeopathically? Because that's what you write. Can you shed some light on this?
So just to explain homeopathy, for those who may not know it, basically homeopathy is curing by the thing that causes the illness. So to speak, vaccines actually work that way. You have a little bit of the virus, or the dead virus, is injected into you so that you can defeat the full-on virus. You see this early on in literature. In the New Testament, Christ cures by using spittle, and usually spit is seen as a dirty thing, but so he's using dirt, so to speak, to cure. There's one of my favorite Old English medical cures, quote unquote, is for women who are hemorrhaging. They need to stand over steaming horse turds so that the steam of the turds, the shit, will somehow cure their bleeding. And there are many, many examples in the book. I mean, it goes on and on. It goes back to the Greeks, to using dirt to cure, using dirt to cleanse even. So what poets often do, any poet, is to make us see what is usually ignored or overlooked, whether it's a loaf of bread or an onion or a weed by the side of the road. And so waste poets, particularly, my favorite is Walt Whitman, they help us see, recognize, acknowledge waste. We can see how waste, whatever aspect of waste it is, poignantly links us to other vulnerable human beings and other non-human actors in the world, whether it's through our own waste production as we're as young as babies, or when we rely on other people's love and care, or at the end of life. And so I think by having us acknowledge this connection, what I call this affinity, it cures us spiritually and emotionally. Now, I'm an optimist, so I really do think literature can change the world. I suppose if that were true, all poets would be, saints. And I don't know if that's true, in fact, but I do like to think that poetry can have some kind of effect in making us see things that we didn't see before, things that were invisible become visible to us. This comes back to that issue of visibility that you brought up earlier. Homeopathic poets, in the waste poets, enable us to see waste. And that's an incredibly important step on the path of curing our environmental ills and also our social ills as well.
Right. Also, how do you read our fear and nervousness when facing a dead body, let's say, or a decaying body, a diseased body, menstrual bodies, bodies with deformities, or simply the viral body during the pandemic? So we immediately convert all these bodies into waste, because they are visibly being visibly wasting in front of our eyes. So, however, an entirely contradictory response is bound up with dead bodies, technically a body which has already been wasted. So they are honored with funeral rites, embellished tombs, prayers, flowers, as if our final attempt at denying waste. Do you think it is like that?
I don't know if it's quite like that. I'll first talk about menstruating bodies, because I have a whole chapter in my book on gender and waste. And of course, women's bodies are often perceived of as waste because of menstruation and so on. The things that, since I deal with the Christian Middle Ages in Europe, there are some delightfully horrible things that authors have written. One 6th century church father wrote that women's menstrual blood, not only does it cause metal to rust, it also causes dogs to have rabies. And of course, in many cultures, women who are menstruating have to live outside of the home or in a special place. Again, that's another physical separation to make them invisible from the people who aren't wasted. But the irony is, of course, everybody's body produces exudings. Everybody's body is not a pristine, pure envelope. There are perforations in it. In everybody's bodies, we have holes through which things flow. And I think that we exile those people who are visibly decaying in some way, because menstrual blood is seen as this kind of reminder of death. There's blood and so on, so that we don't recognize that we're doing the same thing. And yes, I think about dead bodies. I can speak very personally. We had to postpone this interview because my brother died just over 2 weeks ago. He's a Buddhist, And when I arrived there, his body was still in the house 2 days later, and it stayed for his body stayed for 3 days. And it was very hard, but I think it was also very important to be with his body that was slowly wasting away. It helps the people mourning recognize their own humanity and decay, but also to ideally embrace fully the entire being of the person who's passed on. And indeed, wrapping him in a shroud was a very profound experience for me, as part of the mourning rites. So I think that these attitudes, as you talk about, are shunning the wasting body, the dying body, but also having rites around it. I don't know if it's necessarily just to sanitize the decaying body. It's to me, it's more like paying homage to that decaying body and privileging it in a sense, at least in my experience.
Right. So let's come to the aspect of eating now, because of course that precedes shitting. So rather than uniting, what we eat divides us. So what we eat comes out from the other mouth as shit, let's say. And to think in scientific terms, shit is the only thing that is quotidian, recognizable, repetitive, and by its very nature evaporates the distinction between humans, high and low, and animals, because everyone shits or everything shits. There is quite a provoking scene, I remember, in Buñuel's film, The Milky Way, where an innocent bartender asks a priest about the physical manifestation of the Eucharist once it enters the body. Now, what is your opinion on the revolutionary status of feces that way, or shit?
Oh my goodness, I could go on forever and ever. If I could cite another Buñuel film, in that one, people sit at a table shitting together, a very elegant table in
the discreet charm of the bourgeoisie.
Yes, exactly. And people shamedly go into little cubicles to eat by themselves. So Buñuel is turning over all of our expectations in a deliciously outrageous way, mocking, class standards and so on. It's a great moment. But the first moment that you're talking about, where the priest is asked about this, so this is really an important issue, actually, because in traditional Catholic theology, you eat Christ's body and eat Christ's blood. It literally turns into his body and blood. And people in the Middle Ages thought about this, and theologians actually talked for a long time about, well, if you eat Christ's body and blood, do you excrete it? And so a whole theological argument was created called accident and substance. So the substance that you consume, Christ's body and blood, remains Christ's body and blood. You only excrete the accident of the bread and the wine. Because the idea that you can actually excrete Christ's body and blood was clearly too much of an anathema for theologians to accept, and for common people as well. I mean, as you point out, everyone poops, as the children's book, the popular children's book is entitled. And so, I think that that's sort of indicative of a certain attitude of finding excrement repulsive or disturbing. And so there's a whole theological argument to get out of that possibility that something sacred could also excrete. Now, I think our homeopathic poets like Walt Whitman would in fact find someone's dirt or excrement or weakness in that way actually a moment for delving into compassion and affinity with the whole world. So that's a different kind of approach.
Right. So you have extensively covered in your book Chaucer and his Fecopoetics, and then on dealt with Shakespeare, Swift, Eliot, Beckett. So how waste-ridden do you think has been, Western litter-ature, as you write it so amazingly. Now, what I really want to ask is whether writers have always been conscious of the metonymic and symbolic potential of waste.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what I discovered. I don't think they sat down and said, I'm going to do a waste studies book, but that's what first got me interested in Chaucer. So my first book was on women pilgrims in the Middle Ages because nobody had written a book on them. And I thought, of course, there's a book in the library on women in the Middle Ages who were pilgrims, and it wasn't there. So I had to write that. And then I started working on more pilgrimage literature from the 14th century, like Dante and Chaucer and others. And I noticed that they mentioned excrement quite a bit. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I'll just write a couple of pages on excrement. But once you delve into a topic, especially one like excrement, it leads you to so many other things like theological ideas, legal cases, historical events involving excrement, believe it or not, literature, of course, philosophical ideas, and so on. And so it became its own book on excrement. And one of the key players in this is Geoffrey Chaucer, particularly in the Canterbury Tales. He dies in 1400, so he's writing over 600 years ago. That's a long time ago for someone to be focused on explicitly excrement and waste, and he treats it in many different ways that adhere to that spectrum I was talking about, the ways that medieval people viewed excrement, from seeing shit as sin to seeing it as a kind of regenerative element in nature, if you will. But you can go further back than that. Beowulf, for example, the Old English epic, deals with waste, really human bodies as waste. Beowulf's body at the end is treated, well, talk about burial rites. Not to, I think, strip him of his dead and decaying body, but for people to find meaning in that particular death. And of course, if you go all the way back to the Greeks, the play Philoctetes deals with someone whose curse, if you will, has been to have this wound that smells putridly. Nobody wants to be near him. And so he's perceived as an example of waste, and that's going back over 2,000 years ago. So I think that waste, because it's just part of our human life, wherever you live at any time period, writers, poets, composers, artists are going to have to deal with it because it's part of what they perceive. And artists often will talk about things that the rest of us may not want to acknowledge publicly.
Right. Also, personally, Beckett seems to me, to be a writer who is perpetually preoccupied with waste. Right from the filth outside in Endgame, which you at length talk about in your book, the garbage heap which covers Winnie in Happy Days, which you also mentioned there, to useless bodies in his novels, in Malloy and Malone Dies. Now, what is waste for Beckett? Or primarily for writers like him, from Antoniato to all the people like Sartre or even Camus, who writes extensively on waste and Caligula. Is it the ruins of the last war, the contingent body, existence itself, the muck of excess language? What do you think it is?
I would say yes, 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 and yes. It's all of that. I mean, famously in Endgame, people think, is this the apocalypse that's taken place outside? The parents are in garbage cans. I mean, that's pretty indicative right there that it's demanding that you have to think about waste when looking at them. Also language, and I'm not a Beckett scholar, I'm just attracted to Beckett and I do want to know more about Beckett. I find the language so poetic and stripped down, if you will, in a great way. So I don't know if that's Beckett saying excessive language is waste, or if we can discover the waste in our lives through language. I mean, obviously he must have thought that that was the case since he devoted his life to language. I'm very much like Winnie. I'm the eternal optimist, even when surrounded by waste, as it gets higher and higher. So I think it's a little bit of everything there. But I also think that Beckett, and maybe I'm misreading him, I don't find him to be utterly pessimistic, despite the waste that is philosophically infiltrating us and the waste that is in the world and so on. I think that, you know, a sense of humor or irony can also be a salvational aspect of our lives. And for him too, to confront us with waste, parents and trash cans, Winnie being, you know, increasingly in this pile, forces us to reflect on waste in our own lives. He wants us to recognize that.
Right. And this is my last question. So for my last question, I would like to shift to mythology and fabulation. Donna Haraway, in her Tulusin, you know, she observes that we are compost, and you know, immediately when I was reading your waste, I remembered that. So we are compost, not post-human. She says we inhabit the humicities, and I'm a compostist, she says. Now, the primary focus here is on our elemental nature, as Haraway would say. So on the other hand, ashes and funeral grounds play a major role in the understanding of death in Hinduism. So for example, ash is the last point of reduction, the final indestructible component, which is of course, you know, post-death, post you burn the body. Now, would you say that we can reinstall the ethical appeal of waste through the force of myth and, let's say, futuristic storytelling?
Oh, absolutely. I absolutely agree with that. I mean, this is our salvation, is storytelling for each other. But my hope is also that writers and creators look to the past for inspiration. I believe that there is progress in terms of science and technology, obviously, but I'm not sure about progress in terms of the heart. I think that we can learn a lot about how to conduct our lives in more ethical ways by also looking back, so that I think that the best myth telling or futuristic storytelling has deep roots in stories that have been told in the past. Perhaps they're going to be refashioned for the future in some way. But by looking to the past, we can it can teach us how to conduct our lives better for the future, and we can see that fulfilled in new myths and futuristic stories that are clearly grounded, and I mean grounded in the dirt of the past, to enable us all to live more compassionately to others, to see our affinity with wasted humans, and perhaps in terms of the environment, to reduce the kind of waste that we're producing in the world.
Right. Thank you so much. And can we now open the session for questions? If anyone has if anyone has a question on this wasted platform, they can ask. Yeah, I can see Professor Clark is there. So thank you so much for attending this session, Professor Clark. Anyone has a question?
I just wanted to add, for those of you who may be new to the waste studies field, so my my excrement book came out in 2008. The waste book came out in 2015. I mean, this is now a field. It's an established field of study. It's sometimes called discard studies, dirt studies, but there's a vast array of things that are published and explored in this particular field, not just in literature, but as I mentioned earlier, in other fields as well. Anthropology, of course, is an obvious one. So if you're interested in you know, becoming a waste scholar, it's a very big garbage heap. We want more garbage producers like us to look at different works. We can't all look at the same things, and we see them with different eyes. So I encourage people to explore this field.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I don't think we have any questions right now. So
oh, well, I'll throw one out there.
Okay, yes. Hello, Professor Clark.
Hi, Professor Morrison.
Hi.
Hello from Lubbock, Texas.
Oh my gosh! Wow, you're just down the road.
Just down the road a piece at Texas Tech. my last book was on Gaia. Okay, so of course all things recycle in Gaia eventually. And so Lynn Margulis is the hero of my approach to Gaia. And she was a microbiologist by specialization. So, and I've collected some video clips of that were made of her out in the field talking about microbial mats, and there's this one wonderful scene where she's sort of picked up some muck from the salt marsh or whatever where she's standing, and she's saying waste. She says waste. It doesn't go out. Waste. It doesn't go out. It goes around. Waste goes around. And of course, the point is Gaian ecological, that what the microbes have had 4 billion years to work on is making the waste of one the food of the other.
Yes.
And so if you just look at the microcosm, which is the foundation of all the rest of life, it resolves its own recycling issues by simply reincorporating waste as food. And so she sort of intimates that we could learn from the microbes, right? That the challenge now really is to redeem the waste that we're making by putting it back where it needs to go, so it becomes food stock or feed stock, industrially speaking. In other words, industrial waste, which is abiological, but nevertheless, it would be recoverable. And we're making, these sort of baby steps towards a recycling economy. Yes. But so to me, this is the resolution. I'm just curious about your thoughts about the resolution of waste from a larger perspective, by which we human waste makers reintegrate ourselves with a wider ecology.
Yeah, oh, thank you for all that. And when you were talking, I was thinking there's a wonderful book on dirt. I think it's called In Praise of Dirt. In any case, there are short essays about
soil
dirt.
Yes. Soil is, of course, dirt is dirt, but soil is full of life.
Well, that's the point of the book, is to say that dirt gets a bad rap. In fact, it is really, soil is like, oh, soil's good, it causes plants to grow. But dirt is really a synonym for the same thing, but it's used in a pejorative way. And so we have to embrace, dirty, we have to embrace dirt. It's basically in praise of dirt, is the argument here. But I totally agree with you. I do think that, as you say, we're only making baby steps now, in terms of reintegrating waste and being able to use it. That gets back to the capitalistic argument. If something's not used, that makes it waste. But I think that is the only way that we can, in terms of the environment and issues of pollution and so on, the only way that we can go ahead, it seems, is by reutilizing this material. One of my other concerns is really a kind of, well, I've mentioned ethics or compassion in the world. And that's why poetry, which is, one of my main modes of being and teaching poetry and so on, to see it as actually something that might be able to change people's minds about the world and recognizing it. I think that acknowledging and seeing that we're in waste all the time will help us reduce the toxic forms of waste. But Gay Hawkins in The Ethics of Waste has an interesting chapter about someone who lives with, I can't remember if it's a man or a woman, lives with their own excrement production in the backyard by having worms, work through that sewage, if you will, to turn it into useful compost. It would be hard to achieve that in mega cities, but the point is people at one point lived with their waste, essentially reused it. And is there a way that we in such a highly populated world could do that also? I don't know.
Well, there's got to be. I mean, our friends, the microbes, are taking care of it one way or another. To get to my house here, I'm in a little community where our sewage treatment plant is, I drive right by it on the way home. It's sort of just, I'm a little ways out in the country. Just by, it's sort of down, it's sort of lower down so that as I drive by it, I can see the tops of the tanks where these like rotors are circulating and the process is bubbling up. And I reflect, well, there are friends, the microbes, just taking care of business to detoxify. I mean, that's the thing, because the toxicity is sort of the pathology of waste when it's allowed to get to turn bad. But in and of itself, it's perfectly, it's all good in Gaia.
Yes.
Take the largest view. But I very much enjoyed your overview of the sort of, your humanistic and literary explorations. It reminded me of two pop culture. Well, one's a pop culture reference. I don't know if you remember Patti Smith way back when she started out. She did like a 10-minute version of Gloria, which was just like ultra poetic. And she got to this point where she was riffing and she was going, the transformation of waste, the transformation of waste. Do you remember that?
I don't, but I'm going to have to look at that again.
Yes, I think that was in her first album. But then, of course, Crying of Lot 49, I don't remember the waste system. In Pynchon's short novel there, although, and there it was bound up with Maxwell's demon and the discourse of energy and entropy. So you've got this whole, and entropy then is is waste energy in the thermodynamic sense.
I'm glad. My sense is, I want to read your book. My sense is you sound like an optimist like me, even despite all the things that we read in the world about, pollution and so on,
Well,
that we still perceive there's a way forward.
We just have to change the way we think about death.
Yeah, I think that's true.
We can, that's the price we pay for being eukaryotic sexual organisms. Death comes along with the package. So,
that's right.
And when you die, your body goes back to its elements and then is ready. Of course, you need to think in the temporal. These processes need time to work themselves out, which isn't really the human temporality, but we need to change.
Yes.
So, I mean, we have to do it. So you might as well be optimistic. We'll either do it or we won't. But if we don't, we're wasting. We're wasting what we've accomplished.
Indeed.
Humanly speaking.
I wanted to share an anecdote from a student. I was teaching a course on waste studies, and people were really into waste in this class. Of course, when she started discussing it, you see it everywhere. And I had this student, a woman who was had two male roommates. She was a grad student, so they were sharing an apartment. And she proposed to them that they remove the door to the bathroom for a week. So she got a screwdriver and she removed the hinges. And so she said, I think we need to remove this door for a week just to see what would happen. Because she was, we were reading about Freudian theories and all this kind of stuff. And she said that her two male roommates were really disturbed by this. They couldn't go to the bathroom with the door not there and not close. She said she had less of a problem. I think that also is a gendered thing. Women often go to the stereotype is women go to the bathroom to talk to other women. And so there's kind of a more culture for that, perhaps. But I mean, performing experiments I thought that was really clever of my student, and she thought it was very funny. But I think it was kind of a jokey anecdote, but it does indicate that people are very nervous about their own and other people's waste. And that may be funny in this situation, but in terms of a huge society of billions of people, it's a problem because we do have to recognize what we're producing and what's going on, and not just try to
Yes, we
repress
need a
it.
revolution in potty training.
Yes.
Don't be ashamed.
That sounds like a book title. Well, thank you for all those comments.
Sure.
You're giving me hope in the world.
Well, I'm
Right.
happy if that's the case.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morrison, for your profound insights into wasted lives and literatures of waste, and for making us, for walking with us through the dumping grounds of memories after animal carcasses, technological excesses, ragpickers, and sewage cleaners. So I really hope we'll have such sessions with you in the near future. And thank you so
I
much.
hope so. Thank you for asking me. I wish we could be together in person, maybe one day in the next few years. Let's hope so.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.